Welcome to Fanfic Nation, where stories cross borders, heroes rise against fate, and what if becomes legend. From epic battles to unseen timelines, this is the nation of fan made worlds. Subscribe and step beyond the canon. This novel is written by JD 787. Amid the rhythmic pounding of the battering ram against the gate, burning barrels of oil crashed down around the siege engine, ignited by unseen fuses or flaming arrows. A wall of fire erupted, engulfing the head of the battering ram. Soldiers splashed with burning oil shrieked and broke away from the protection of shields and wooden panels. The fortunate ones managed to roll on the ground, smothering the flames before scrambling back under cover, while the unlucky were struck down by stones and arrows before they could even react. Yet for every defender who revealed themselves to attack, a volley from the masked archers, poised 100 meters away, cut them down in turn. With every passing moment, men were wounded or killed. Boom, boom. The battering ram's front end was fully engulfed in flames, but the siege engine itself had been reinforced with thick, fire-resistant leather soaked to prevent burning. The material slowed the spread of the fire, buying the soldiers enough time to make a few more desperate attempts at breaking the gate. But with more oil barrels raining down, the siege vehicle would soon be rendered useless. Aegor didn't want to keep watching. The attack would likely end with the siege engine's destruction. So far, the total casualties on both sides had barely reached 3 digits, a mere fraction compared to the more than 100,000 troops present. A casualty rate of 1 in 1,000 seemed insignificant, but for the men caught in the blood and fire at the gate, it was anything but. The narrow battlefield limited the scale of the battle and kept the casualty rate from rising too quickly, yet the ferocity of the fighting at the Bloody Gate and on the ramparts was no less brutal than any legendary siege of ages past. Everyone lived in the center of their own world. How could the soldiers on the front lines be reduced to mere numbers, just a 1 in a force of 100,000? To children, war was a distant tale. To the young, war was the pinnacle of glory. But Aegor was no longer a boy, standing on the battlefield, hearing the agonized groans and dying screams of wounded men. He felt more vividly than ever before that war was no game. This war was not of Aegor's making, but it was undeniably connected to him. He turned away, preparing to leave the battlefield and return to camp. Then, all around him, a deafening roar of cheers and applause erupted. Aegor whirled back in shock, instantly realizing what had caused the soldiers to cry out. The head of the battering ram, still wrapped in flames, had broken through the outer gate of the Bloody Gate and lodged itself in the doorway. What? It's broken already? Was Robert's strategy of fire suppression and ramming tactics simply that advanced? Or had every other force that had attempted to breach this fortress over the past 1,000 years just been too weak? As the cheers thundered, a group of cavalry clad in House Baratheon's colors spurred forward, charging for the shattered gate. If they could hold their ground and prevent the defenders from resealing the entrance, then the Bloody Gate, the pass that had never fallen in all of history, would finally be conquered in the name of King Robert. But faster than the cavalry were the soldiers who had manned the battering ram. Before the flames could completely consume the siege engine, they heaved it aside and rushed through the broken gateway. After all, who wouldn't want to be the first to claim credit for taking the fortress, a chance to be knighted, to become a noble, perhaps even to secure a legacy for their descendants? It felt unreal. After all that preparation, was it truly over in a single battle? What had happened to the legendary claim that one man could hold back 1,000? What of the promise that the pass would never be taken? Aegor felt a strange mix of embarrassment and relief. No matter what, if the battle ended quickly, there would be fewer casualties, and that was no bad thing. But just as the watching soldiers began laughing at the absurdity of a month-long siege ending in half a day, the situation suddenly shifted. The coalition soldiers who had rushed through the broken gate suddenly came scrambling back less than 10 seconds later. Under a fresh hail of falling stones and arrows, they shouted warnings as they fled desperately back to their lines. Many were cut down in the retreat, and even the Baratheon cavalry was forced to pull back. The assault had been repelled. Crossbowmen, who had been providing covering fire, were hastily ordered to withdraw. The trebuchet bombardment was suspended, and the siege equipment was pulled back beyond the defenders' range. Apart from the siege engine still burning beneath the bloody gate, the first assault was over. Word quickly spread from the mouths of the retreating soldiers, passing from one man to the next until it finally reached Aegor's ears. The defenders of the Bloody Gate had completely sealed the gate with earth and stone. This was a devastating setback. With the first assault repelled and the second not yet organized, it was clear that the news had caught Robert and his commanders off guard. Until they devised a new strategy, Aegor estimated there would be no further battle. After some minor disruptions, things finally returned to normal. The Bloody Gate was not so easily breached after all. Aegor turned away from the battlefield and made his way back to his small tent deep within the coalition army's encampment. Though called a military camp, it resembled a vast city of tents. Based on sheer population density, it could rival some of the largest cities in Westeros. The only difference was that instead of common folk, its inhabitants were mostly soldiers and nobles. To accommodate so many people, merchants had set up shop in the heart of the six great military camps, catering to every need imaginable. As long as one had coin, there was little that couldn't be bought: inns, taverns, brothels, bathhouses. From a distance it looked like a sprawling mass of tents, but within it functioned as a city in its own right. It was as if the bustling commercial district of King's Landing had been uprooted and transplanted to the valley's entrance, albeit with worse service and inflated prices. Normally, no commander would tolerate such an atmosphere in a military camp. But in truth, the rebel forces were trapped within the vale, hemmed in behind the Bloody Gate. Every fief and castle belonging to the mutinous lords had already fallen under Robert's control, and the army's patrols and scouts kept constant watch outside the camp. The warrior king leading this campaign had left no room for his enemies to turn the tide. Barring an internal uprising, the camp was impregnable. Perhaps I should set up a temporary night's watch office and join in on the trade. The chief logistics officer considered the thought seriously, but before he could dwell on it, his attention was drawn to a commotion nearby, a tent crowded with soldiers from all six armies, each clad in different uniforms. They were arguing, voices rising heatedly as they fought over some item being sold by the tent's owner. Aegor was curious, but as a man of status, he had subordinates for such matters. There was no need for him to investigate personally. "Kathy, go see what they're fighting over," he ordered. The boy darted off, slipping through the crowd like an eel. Half a minute later, he emerged and ran back, his face a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Sir, it's a book," Kathy blurted out. "The book we printed." Aegor's eyelid twitched as a thought immediately struck him. If the soldiers were this eager over something, it could only be something risque. Something with both pictures and text that wasn't exactly presentable. He strode toward the tent, and as he got closer, the argument between the stall owner and the soldiers became clear. "Are you trying to rob me? 10 silver stacks for this piece of trash?" "Robbery? Open your eyes, fool. This is a book." The stall owner, unfazed by the soldier's indignation, flipped through the pages in his hand, displaying the contents as he shouted back. Most of the merchants operating near the military camp were no ordinary peddlers. They had connections, and with the kings and lords of six kingdoms gathered here, few common soldiers would dare act recklessly. "Do you have any idea how many sheets of paper are in this? How much ink was used for these illustrations? A few months ago, your entire year's wages couldn't have bought a book this thick. Do you understand?" The purchase price alone was 5 silver stacks. "And do you know what it cost to transport it all the way from King's Landing?" "Buy it or don't, but don't waste my time. I've got plenty of customers." "Fine, take the damn thing and stay out of my sight. You should have done that from the start, wasting my time like this." Many soldiers paid up and left, clutching their purchases as they returned to their barracks with their comrades. As the crowd thinned, Aegor finally stepped forward and glanced at the stall's wares. Fascinating. A bookstall, something Westeros had never seen before. Laid out before him were 5 or 6 books of varying thickness and design. Titles like A Lady's Tale and The Romance of Young Aegon left little to the imagination. and among them, the fantasy adventures of the Night's Watch, the very story Aegor himself had outlined. It was a strange feeling seeing the industry he had set in motion thriving even in his absence. The books had followed him to the battlefield. He did a quick calculation and frowned. Given the production capacity of the paper mill and printing press, the church's order for the seven-pointed star shouldn't have been completed yet. So how had these books hit the market so quickly? Either Tyrion had miraculously expanded production at an astonishing speed, or the cunning Lannister had spotted a lucrative opportunity and deliberately postponed existing orders in favor of printing these popular titles, entertaining the idle soldiers of the Vale Rebellion while making a fortune of them. Tyrion, you genius. I didn't even see this coming. What irked him, though, was that the book he had been most proud of, his own adventure journey, had sold the worst, with more than a dozen unsold copies still stacked at the stall. Meanwhile, the salacious books he personally found distasteful had nearly sold out. The best-selling title, and the most expensive, was something called The King's Hundred Beauties. Curious, Aegor picked it up and flipped through it, only to have his eyes nearly pop out of his skull. Each page featured a portrait of a woman posed seductively. That much wasn't surprising. What was astonishing was the detailed information printed on the back of each page: name, age, background, and location. It was a comprehensive directory of nearly every brothel in King's Landing, listing not only the establishments but also their most renowned courtesans. This wasn't the King's Hundred Beauties. It was a damn guidebook. Aegor nearly laughed aloud. Gods knew where Tyrion had gotten the inspiration for this, but the concept was genius. With barely any words and nothing but useful information, it was the perfect book for its target audience. Soldiers with this in hand could pretend to be seasoned regulars, effortlessly navigating King's Landing's pleasure houses. No wonder it was flying off the shelves. His own adventure journey couldn't possibly compete. Wait a minute. Isn't this basically a paid advertisement for these places? If it were me, I'd be charging the brothels for placement fees. Then the realization hit him. If he could think of that, surely Tyrion had too. Gods only knew how much business the Night's Watch had expanded and how much coin they had raked in during his absence. If you're not buying, stop wasting my time. The stall owner yanked the book from Aegor's hands. But as he glanced up and noticed the black of Aegor's attire, something clicked in his mind. Hesitantly he asked, are you the chief logistics officer, Lord Aegor? Before Aegor could answer, a familiar voice called his name from behind. Turning, he found himself facing Buckwell, a man he had become quite familiar with in recent days. Though Buckwell had never been arrogant or dismissive, he was still a landed noble, a lord, and by the laws of Westeros, his rank was far above that of a Night's Watch officer. Courtesy was one thing, but politeness should never be mistaken for true equality. Aegor didn't dare show disrespect. He stepped away from the stall, walked a few paces forward, and greeted him properly. My lord, good morning. Will his grace be continuing the assault on the bloody gate today? The old knight had the privilege of attending Robert's war councils, making him a reliable source of information. Not likely, Buckwell answered. His grace has realized the bloody gate is not easily taken. He's shifting focus to the rebel castles outside the Vale. Half the army will be redirected tomorrow to deal with those easier targets. Then the old knight stepped aside, introducing the figure standing behind him. This is Lady Marjorie Tyrell. She read your story and wished to meet you. She visited your tent but couldn't find you. Luckily, your black cloak makes you easy to spot. Igor started in surprise, only now noticing the young woman standing just behind the old earl. Lady Marjorie, he greeted smoothly, regaining his composure. You are even more beautiful than the songs say. Please accept my apologies for being so difficult to find. You are too kind, my lord, Marjorie replied with effortless grace. Meeting an adventurer such as yourself has long been a dream of mine. Reading a tale in a book is one thing, but hearing it told by the man who lived it is quite another. If you are not too busy, would you share your story with me? She read the adventures of the Night's Watch. Igor realized immediately. It would be my pleasure, he said with a smile. I've met my match. When it comes to saying one thing to one person and another to someone else, who in Westeros could possibly rival the daughter of Mace Tyrell, the sister of the Knight of Flowers, the most cunning girl in the realm, known as the Rose of Highgarden? The young woman before him had soft curls of chestnut hair and bright, doe-like eyes. She was about the same age as Nina. Like Arya and Nina, her gaze shimmered with admiration and fascination. But Aegor knew better. This little rose had been personally trained by the Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna Redwyne. A girl raised in such an environment, one who sought to restore her family's influence through marriage, could never be anyone's mere admirer, least of all a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. Aegor was well aware that he, bound by oath and removed from the political games of the nobility, could never be a true player in the grand schemes of Westeros. If I consider myself merely a latecomer to the art of deception, then this seemingly innocent girl before me must have been steeped in it from birth, a graduate of the highest school of political intrigue. Our strengths aren't even on the same level. My only advantage is that I know more about her than she expects. Why would a noble lady of her stature come to the battlefield? Aegor found it puzzling at first, but the answer came quickly enough. If he, an outsider to court politics, could see that this war was a prime opportunity to build alliances and connections, how could the true power players not recognize the same? The little Rose was here for a reason. As for why she sought him out specifically, that remained to be seen. It would take careful listening and a measured response to uncover the truth hidden in her words. Scheming often carries a negative connotation, but if you call it cleverness, it suddenly sounds far more admirable. Everyone has desires, goals, ambitions, but there is no reason to treat ambition as something sinister. It is the very force that drives people to act, the engine of society's progress. Altruism is indeed a noble and virtuous quality, beneficial for the survival of a group. But pure altruism, that does not exist. Creatures that lack the instinct for self preservation, that do not know how to compete for resources, were long ago eliminated by nature. People must have desires, they must have ambitions. The key difference lies in whether they understand what they want, why they want it, and whether they possess the ability and strength to achieve it. Cersei is the perfect example of ambition gone astray. She is cunning, yes, but her scheming is meaningless. She wants everything yet lacks the foresight to understand why she wants it or how to obtain it properly. She seldom considers the consequences of her actions. A fool, but not a simple fool, that is what makes her truly dangerous. She turns allies into enemies with ease, yet is unpredictable as an opponent. One cannot reason with a player who refuses to follow the rules. Aegor had always kept his distance from such chaotic personalities, and even knights like Jaime were wary of entanglements with them. But Marjorie was a perfect example of a competent schemer. Her goal was clear. She sought to restore House Tyrell's influence, diminished after backing the wrong side in Robert's rebellion through marriage, securing a place for her family at the very heart of power. Unlike Cersei, she had the intelligence, patience, and strategic mind to see that goal realized. To mistake her gentleness for kindness was to invite ruin. She could bleed a man dry while smiling sweetly. But as long as one recognized her nature and made it clear they would not be easily led, she became far less dangerous. Marjorie Tyrell was not a little finger. She did not need to disrupt the board to gain power. She was already among the nobility, already one of the privileged few who held a seat at the table. She was willing to share the spoils as long as her own position remained secure. To put it simply, she was an ambitious yet pragmatic player of the Game of Thrones. As long as one possessed sufficient power and leverage, they could deal with her confidently, knowing she would not suddenly act irrationally or turn on them without reason. Lord Aegor, they say this story is based on your adventures. Did you truly experience all of it firsthand? Marjorie asked gently. Her voice was soft, pleasant to the ear. That's right, though it's been somewhat dramatized. Marjorie's eyes sparkled with curiosity, the picture of an eager adventurer at heart. Her performance was so flawless that Aegor felt a chill creep up his spine. Carefully choosing his words, he responded, "The experiences are real, but the dangers were exaggerated. If I had truly endured all that and barely survived, I would have locked myself indoors, never to set foot outside again, let alone return to Westeros." "That does make sense." Marjorie chuckled, her expression warm and innocent. Then, as if casually, she asked, "May I call you Aegor? Is that Senna you hail from truly west of the Sunset Sea? Where exactly is it? How far is the journey? What is she after?" "Are the Tyrells looking to establish trade with Senna?" Aegor felt a flicker of suspicion but masked it well. He could not afford to be careless. "I was merely a guest aboard that voyage," he answered smoothly. "I know little of navigation, much less our exact location. I couldn't even be certain we sailed directly east the entire time. As for the distance, I only recall that the journey lasted over a month. Considering that our vessel was far more advanced than any ship in Westeros and that we traveled with the winds, I can only estimate Sena should be somewhere west of the Sunset Sea, perhaps 2 or 3,000 leagues from Westeros." "That far?" "Armanti." Marjorie sighed wistfully. "What a pity! I had hoped to visit such a wondrous land. I am afraid I must disappoint you, Lady Marjorie," Aegor replied, allowing a hint of melancholy to seep into his voice. "Even if someone were to gift me a fully manned ship this very moment, I would have no way of finding my way home. I don't even know if my family is still waiting for me across the sea, or if I will ever see them again." "Do not despair," Marjorie said, her voice laced with sympathy. "Fate brought you to Westeros. Perhaps this land is where you were meant to be, and with your experiences and talents, Lord Aegor, I have no doubt you will find success wherever you go." She comforted him with an earnest look, and he expressed his gratitude in turn. As the daughter of a great lord, she addressed a man of the Night's Watch who held no title nor could ever claim one as lord. It was almost nauseating. Aegor had a feeling that dealing with Marjorie would do wonders for his ability to maintain a straight face, improve his reflexes in conversation, and sharpen his resistance to manipulation. But the sensation of his skin crawling was deeply unpleasant all the same. Still, he kept his composure as they walked through the military camp, conversing as they went. Marjorie continued to probe him about the stories in the fantasy adventures of the Night's Watch. But Aegor had already prepared for such an interrogation. Without hesitation, he spun elaborate tales, some based on real events, others fabricated so seamlessly that no outsider could tell truth from fiction. Trailing behind them, Sir Buckwell remained silent, listening but offering no commentary. The man was an earl, yet in this exchange he played the role of an observer, a mere bystander to Marjorie's charm. "By the way, Lord Aegor, I've heard that not only is this book based on your adventures, but it was also produced in a factory you established." After much circling around, Marjorie finally steered the conversation toward reality. "I noticed the material of this book doesn't seem to be parchment, and the text doesn't appear to be handwritten. How did you manage that? Here we go." After so much pleasant conversation and careful flattery, she was finally getting to the point. Author's note: this chapter peels back the glamour of war to show its true face: chaos, calculation, and quiet cruelty. Steel breaks gates, but coin, ink, and ambition slip through far deeper cracks. In Westeros, sieges end, yet games only begin.
If a lesser man, unfamiliar with her true nature, were to be charmed by such a noble beauty, skillfully coaxed into boasting and subtly pressed for details, he might spill everything he knew. Fortunately, Aegor had been waiting for this moment, so this was what she was after: papermaking and printing. Now that he understood her objective, it would be much easier to handle. "Yes, that's true," Aegor admitted with a casual nod. "The books are produced by a factory under the Night's Watch. But I only oversee funding, set general direction, and ensure our profits support the watch with food and supplies. The specifics are handled by the craftsmen. If you're asking how it's done, I'm afraid I couldn't tell you." He shook his head apologetically before offering, "However, as it happens, the Night's Watch is looking to expand and is in need of investment. If Lady Marjorie is interested, I'd be happy to give you a personal tour when I return to King's Landing." Although Margaery's attempt to outmaneuver Aegor had failed, and all her acting and charm had been in vain, she did not lose her composure. She did not grow angry or flustered. That alone placed her leagues ahead of Cersei Lannister. When she realized she would not get anything more out of him, she remained as poised as ever, continuing their conversation in a sweet and pleasant tone. She made one final attempt, but when it became clear Aegor would not budge, she gracefully let the matter drop for now. After all, compared to making money, she had a far more pressing mission to accomplish in the north. Since Lord Aegor has said so, I will wait until this battle is over before visiting the Night's Watch office in King's Landing to see this enterprise for myself. For the briefest moment, the mask of admiration and respect slipped. Her expression turned cool, even prideful. But the glimpse of her true face was fleeting before Aegor could fully register it. She had already replaced it with another carefully crafted expression. Ah, the wounded from today's siege have been brought down. I have some knowledge of healing, so I shall go visit them and see to their care. My lords, if you will excuse me. Ah, time to put on the beloved by the common folk act again. Watching Margaery's graceful figure as she walked away, Aegor felt a flicker of amusement, but there was no contempt in it. He did not look down on her for it. Pretend long enough and you become what you pretend to be. A person's ambitions and motives were secondary to their actions. Margaery was skilled in performance, but that was simply a basic requirement for any competent politician. And if she maintained that act for a lifetime, who was to say she wouldn't become a truly great queen? If only she had been born 10 years earlier, she might have had a chance with Robert. That little fox is utterly heartless. The words came from Buckwell, who had been observing from the sidelines. I was worried she'd trick you, and I nearly stepped in to warn you more than once, but it seems I was concerned for nothing. You are the man Tyrion Lannister chose as his partner after all. How could you fall for such an obvious trap? House Tyrell was powerful and wealthy, but they were not Buckwell's liege lords. He had no need to speak kindly of them. There aren't many in this camp who can make that girl lose face. Robert is one. And now so are you. You flatter me, my lord. Truth be told, it's not easy to refuse such a beautiful woman's request. Aegor chuckled. He had not meant to embarrass Margaery, only to hold his ground. If he hadn't known exactly what kind of person she was, even with all his experience and caution he might have, he would have fallen for her charms. Have you heard the rumors circulating in the camp these past few days? Buckwell asked, stroking his beard. He had initially sought out Aegor for his role in the Night's Watch, but the more he observed him, the more he found the young man intriguing. Everyone says Margaery Tyrell bears a striking resemblance to the late Lady Lyanna Stark. Aegor raised a brow. Oh, is the resemblance truly there, or? Buckwell gave him a knowing look. What do you think? Aegor's eyes glinted. He already understood the subtext. Lyanna Stark, how would the common soldiers in this camp even know what she looked like? This rumor had undoubtedly been deliberately spread by the Tyrells. Margaery had no realistic hope of becoming queen yet, but it seemed she wasn't even above positioning herself as Robert's mistress. For House Tyrell, this girl was willing to sacrifice everything. She should have been born a Tully. Has his grace seen Lady Margaery yet? Aegor asked. He has, Buckwell smirked. He complimented her a few times, and that was the end of it. All her efforts, the styling, the rumors, the carefully chosen dresses were wasted. She is a beauty, but what woman has King Robert not seen? And his grace is no fool. He wouldn't be so easily ensnared by a Tyrell. The old knight twirled his beard thoughtfully. Besides, I doubt even Robert remembers what Lyanna Stark looked like. Forget she resembles her. Even if she were her exact double, I doubt it would move him. Aegor nodded in agreement and sighed. After more than a decade, who still remembers the face of a lost love? Robert Baratheon, who indulged in new conquests and cast off old ones with ease, had long ceased loving the woman Lyanna Stark had been. What he still cherished was the idea of Lyanna, the fiancée stolen from him, the love he was denied. I can bed another man's wife, but no man can bed mine. Robert was, at his core, a petty, domineering scoundrel. He had waited patiently for his betrothed, only for her to elope with another. That was a humiliation no amount of wealth or women could ever erase. No matter how many beauties were offered to him, that wound would never heal. Look around you, what do you see? Buckwell suddenly asked. Aegor frowned at the abrupt shift in conversation. A military camp. He knew the answer wasn't that simple, but he couldn't immediately discern what Buckwell was getting at. Please enlighten me, my lord. The old knight chuckled. I wouldn't call it enlightenment, just an observation. He gestured around them. Most people see an army camp, but what I see is the largest matchmaking event in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegor blinked. No one approaches you, of course you lack noble blood, but look around. How many are here scurrying about, selling themselves or their children into advantageous marriages? Aegor suddenly understood. While I've been promoting the Night's Watch in this camp, the nobles have been negotiating marriage alliances. Everyone is busy securing their futures, and as for whether the rebellion itself would succeed, Robert is probably the only one who truly cares about that. Lady Margaery is one then, who else? He asked. Let's set aside the women trying to seduce Robert. Buckwell said with amusement. Let's talk about those engaged in serious marriage planning. Have you heard of Lord Frey? Aegor laughed. Who hasn't heard of the late Lord Frey? The title late, when placed before a name in Westeros, could mean deceased, and it had been Lord Tully himself who first coined the nickname for Walder Frey. If it had been anyone else, Frey might have drowned them in the Green Fork for the insult. Buckwell smirked. Yes, everyone knows it. But remember not to say it in front of the Freys. Then with a shake of his head he continued, "This time the Freys have sent 2,000 soldiers to aid the campaign, but they also sent a very lovely young lady, Rosalind something or other." "Rosalind Frey? Yes, that's the one, you know her." Buckwell seemed mildly surprised but thought little of it. Compared to her brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews, that girl hardly looks like a Frey at all. Her brother has been taking her to visit many of the High Lords trying to secure a match. I suspect they first aimed for Edmure Tully, but when that failed they set their sights on Robb Stark and even the Lannisters. He sighed. "It's difficult for a new noble house to secure a prestigious match, not high enough for the great houses yet not low enough for lesser lords. She's hit dead ends everywhere. Frankly, I feel sorry for the girl." Aegor smirked. Rosalind Frey had been one of the few women in the show to genuinely surprise him. Among her less fortunate relatives, she was a stark contrast, so much so that some even speculated whether she was truly a Frey at all. "I wonder if she'll be just as striking in this world." Aegor was briefly tempted to meet this so-called beauty, but then he reminded himself, what did her looks have to do with him? Old Walder Frey had lived a long life and fathered countless children, yet Rosalind was one of the few truly beautiful daughters he had. Now he was determined to use her to secure a powerful alliance, refusing to consider anything less than a match that would elevate House Frey's standing. Even ordinary earls were beneath his ambitions. A Night's Watchman running over to admire her beauty, that would be sheer madness. Speaking of which, let's talk about Edmure Tully, the leader of the Riverlands army. He's not young anymore, yet still unmarried. Do you know why? The old knight stroked his beard as he spoke. It's because his father, old Hoster Tully, one of the key players in Robert's rebellion, tasted the benefits of marriage alliances firsthand. Both his daughters made excellent matches, so he refused to settle for anything less for his son. The Freys have tried everything to marry Edmure into their family, offering a dowry so generous it could buy Riverrun outright. But Lord Hoster was adamant his son must marry the daughter of a duke. He shook his head. And now, the man is nearly 30, still unmarried, still childless. For a highborn lord, that's rare in Westeros. As one of the founding members of the Baratheon dynasty's great alliance, it was natural for Hoster Tully to seek a match of equal standing for his heir. But must it be a duke's daughter? Were there even any suitable candidates left in Westeros? The north was out of the question. Sansa and Arya Stark were Edmure's nieces. In the Vale, House Arryn had already married into the Tullys, meaning any daughters they might have were in the same position as the Stark girls. The west was even worse. Though the Iron Islands were technically one of the Seven Kingdoms, no one considered the Greyjoys true nobility. As for the Lannisters, the only suitable woman, Cersei, had already been married off to Robert. That left the south. Baratheon family had no eligible daughters aside from Miachella, and Cersei would never marry her beloved child to an uncle. Arianne Martell of Dorne would have been a fine choice, but she had already made a secret pact with Viserys Targaryen, waiting for the return of House Targaryen to reclaim her place, which meant Margaery Tyrell was the only remaining candidate who fit Lord Hoster's standards. Unfortunately, the problem was, House Tyrell was determined to break into the true center of power. And while House Tully was a great house, it simply wasn't influential enough. To put it bluntly, the Tyrells looked down on them. A marriage with House Tully would certainly increase House Tyrell's influence in the Seven Kingdoms and even solidify their control over the Reach, but in peacetime, such benefits were no more than icing on the cake. Even Aegor, a self-proclaimed outsider to noble politics, could see that using Margaery's one and only marriage opportunity for such a marginal gain was hardly worth it. Since Margaery was determined to become queen, if she failed to seduce the king, she would undoubtedly set her sights on the prince instead. Poor Edmure. Who knows when he'll finally settle his marriage? Then again, as the future Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, even if he had no wife, it wasn't as if he would be lacking in lovers or bedmates. Why was he, a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, wasting time worrying about the Tullys' marriage prospects? The thought of the Night's Watch made his chest tighten with sudden, inexplicable anger. His brothers in black were fighting for their lives against wildlings and the true terrors beyond the wall, while these southern nobles treated a military encampment before the Bloody Gate as nothing more than a grand matchmaking event. While soldiers bled and died at the most dangerous pass in Westeros, these lords and ladies were dividing up power and securing their futures. How absurd. What a rotten feudal world. The unprovoked surge of rage passed as quickly as it had come, leaving Aegor unsettled by the strength of his own emotions. Had he spent so long pretending to be a loyal Night's Watchman that he had begun to believe it? He scoffed at himself and shook off the thought. In the end, everyone wants to climb higher, but no one ever truly gets what they want. These alliances are a tangled mess. Buckwell, oblivious to Aegor's brief turmoil, sighed as he gazed at the endless rows of tents. Yes, a mess indeed. But not everyone is aiming for a grand match. I only spoke of nobles who outrank my own house, Buckwell, ambitious men seeking to rise higher. But the Seven Kingdoms are not just made up of great lords. Countless landed knights, minor lords, and small folk thrive in their own circles. In fact, I know of at least 2 marriages that were arranged right here in this camp before the first battle had even begun. Congratulations to them then, Aegor said absently, though he found he no longer cared enough to ask which houses were involved. Instead, he changed the subject. Today's siege was quite the spectacle, but unfortunately the defenders had the upper hand. What is the king's next move? I know he plans to eliminate the rebel strongholds outside the Vale. But we can't just sit here waiting for the Bloody Gate to open on its own, can we? Seeing other noble families securing alliances while his own son was stationed at the wall battling the horrors of the north, Sir Buckwell had little desire to continue discussing marriage. He welcomed the shift in conversation. Of course not, the city beyond the Bloody Gate is not some isolated stronghold, it is the Vale of Arryn, home to hundreds of thousands of people. If we waste time, the rebels inside can hold out indefinitely. We are the ones on a deadline. If we do not breach the gate until the Eyrie itself runs out of food and surrenders, then we've already lost. We need to rescue those who need rescuing, otherwise what's the point? The old knight's words were sharp and clear. No one expected the rebels to completely block the gate, he continued. The Bloody Gate is a narrow choke point, scaling the walls with ladders would be a bloodbath. So at the War Council, we started throwing out ideas. Some suggested tunneling through the collapsed gatehouse to remove the rubble. Others proposed building a ramp up to the walls so infantry could charge in directly. And then of course there were the truly outrageous ones. Someone even suggested digging through the cliffs beside the Bloody Gate to carve a new passage into the Vale. He smirked. You're a Night's Watchman trained in defending fortifications. Tell me, do any of these ideas sound remotely feasible? Aegor had never defended a city in his life, but that didn't stop him from recognizing flawed strategies. If the defenders filled the entrance with rubble, all they have to do is pour a few barrels of oil down the passage and set it alight. Anyone inside suffocates instantly. He shook his head. As for ramps and tunnels, my lord, you just said that we are the ones on a time limit. Do we really have the time to construct something like that? Exactly. Those are the key problems, Buckwell agreed. None of these ideas are particularly practical, but they were proposed at the War Council. So while we can discuss them freely here, best keep such opinions to yourself around the commanders. Understood. Military secrets, understood. As they continued toward the camps of the Royal Army and the Lords of the Crownlands, it became evident that an attack would not be launched today. Large numbers of soldiers were returning to their barracks, confirming that the command had decided to halt the assault for now. After exchanging farewells, Aegor and Buckwell parted ways, each returning to their own tent. The next morning, in the aftermath of the failed siege, more than 30,000 of the 80,000 troops stationed outside the Bloody Gate were deployed across the Vale's outer regions. Their mission, capturing the exposed castles and keeps outside the valley. The remaining forces were divided into 6 groups, each aligned with its respective great house and kingdom. These divisions would take turns holding defensive positions and launching attacks. The reasoning behind this strategy was obvious. By sealing the Bloody Gate, the rebels had also sealed themselves inside. This prevented them from launching any surprise raids outside the valley. Under such conditions, keeping the entire royalist army on high alert at all times would be an enormous drain on resources. Worse, it would lead to fatigue and eventual exhaustion. Instead of exhausting the entire force at once, a rotation system was put in place. Whichever group was assigned to active duty on a given day would handle both camp defense and attacks against the gate, more symbolic than genuine assaults meant to keep pressure on the enemy. On the surface, it appeared to be a battle of attrition. But the question remained, what if the rebels inside the valley were also rotating their forces? If they rested while the royalists rested, fought only when they needed to, and preserved their strength, that left only one possibility. Robert Baratheon wasn't planning to starve the rebels into submission. He intended to force their surrender by systematically capturing every remaining stronghold in the valley until the rebels had nowhere left to run. After 2 more failed attempts to scale the walls, resulting in hundreds of casualties and no progress, the war to quell the rebellion fell into a tactical stalemate. Both the attackers and defenders found themselves in an awkward impasse, neither side able to advance nor willing to retreat. The nobles of the so-called Alliance of Righteous had launched their revolt with the hope that righteousness and the natural defenses of the Bloody Gate would be enough to drive out that madwoman, Lysa Arryn, and reclaim their autonomy. They had never expected Robert Baratheon to react with such explosive fury, summoning the armies of the 6 kingdoms to crush his former allies without so much as an offer of negotiation. As for Robert himself, he had been so supremely confident in his own military genius that he never doubted his ability to take the Bloody Gate by force. That was why he had called the Lords of Westeros to witness his campaign, expecting them to watch a swift and glorious victory. He had never imagined the rebels in the Vale would be this stubborn. For days the 2 armies remained deadlocked, staring at one another across the Bloody Gate. Eventually, it was the rebels who made the first concession. They sent envoys to propose peace talks. Their leader Yohn Royce was willing to admit to treason, abdicate his lordship in favor of his son, and take the Black, all in exchange for a single condition. Lysa Arryn must leave the Vale and Robert must spare the other noble houses from punishment. It was a remarkably generous offer, but Robert refused. He demanded unconditional surrender. Any other terms would only be considered after the rebels laid down their arms. Aegor understood Robert's reasoning. Even in modern times, some nations held a strict policy of never negotiating with terrorists. The logic was simple: if rebellion could be bargained with, there would never be an end to it. If Robert allowed one group of rebels to negotiate their way out of consequences, it would only encourage others to do the same. While the armies remained locked in stalemate, Aegor had no idea whether the sieges on the outer castles of the Vale were progressing any better. But rather than waste time pondering battles beyond his reach, he turned his attention to something far more productive: making money. While the lords debated war strategies and planned their next moves, Aegor was busy casting a wide net, gathering potential investors for the Night's Watch industries. He spent his time walking through the military camps of the great houses, introducing his business ventures to every noble who might be persuaded. Persuading them to invest in anything at all was no easy feat. This was, after all, a world where the very concept of investment was almost unheard of. Nobles hoarded wealth through land and marriage, not through trade and commerce. Still, it was infinitely easier to extract gold from these powerful aristocrats than from the common folk who had little to give in the first place. And through endless trial and error, through failed pitches, revised strategies, and relentless practice, Aegor had steadily refined his skill in selling ideas. He had one clear advantage: proof. His booksellers moved freely between military camps, selling printed works that were flying off the shelves. The demand was visible, the profit was undeniable. Without even realizing it, Aegor found himself invited into an increasing number of noble tents where lords were now willing to sit and listen. More and more of them expressed interest in visiting the factories in King's Landing when the war was over. It was slow progress, but it was progress. Petter Baelish stood on the deck, his gaze fixed indifferently on the horizon. The sea mist was thinning, and the bow of the juniflower cut through the gray-green waters with steady purpose. As a jagged line of rocky ridges emerged from the dissipating fog, the colossal figure of the Titan of Braavos came into view. The Titan stood astride the entrance to the lagoon, his massive stone legs planted on either side of the rocky gap. His lower body, draped in a green-bronze war skirt, seemed carved directly from the same black granite as the reef beneath him. A bronze breastplate gleamed across his torso. Atop his head, a crowned bronze half-helm added to his imposing presence. His hair, fashioned from thick ropes of green hemp, cascaded down his back while his cavernous eyes burned with fire. One enormous hand clutched the ridge of the left cliff, fingers pinching a boulder. The other arm stretched toward the sky, gripping the hilt of a broken sword. The Titan of Braavos was without doubt the largest humanoid statue in the known world. Even without its defensive capabilities, it remained a breathtaking sight. But Petter spared it only a passing glance. He had seen it before. His great-grandfather had been a Braavosi sellsword, though the man's son, Petter's grandfather, had sworn fealty to House Bray and become a knight. That was how House Baelish first came to Westeros. When his grandfather was granted a knighthood, he'd chosen the Titan's head as their family sigil, a nod to his Braavosi roots. Irony. If the old man truly admired the Titan so much, why couldn't he have passed down some of its strength? Instead, Petter inherited a wiry frame, unimpressive height, and a mocking nickname that had stuck with him his entire life. Littlefinger. The first person to call him that was Catelyn Tully. He could still remember the sound of her voice when she said it, soft, teasing, and utterly unaware of the wound it left.
Author's note: this chapter shifts the battlefield from stone walls to smiling faces and careful words. Secrets are guarded not by steel, but by restraint, timing, and the courage to say no. In war and politics alike, the sharpest weapons are patience and clarity.
He had adored her then, he adored her still. That name might have been an insult from anyone else, from her it had been a gift. Petter shook his head, forcing the memory away. He knew better than to dwell on the past. What haunted him now wasn't the girl who never loved him back, it was the invisible hand that had shattered his plans. If the so-called final testimony had been the hammer that crushed his ambitions, then there was someone behind that hammer. Someone who had tracked his every move and exposed his schemes at the most critical moment. A hidden enemy, unseen, unknown, and far more dangerous than anyone else in the game. Yes, Jon Arryn had died by his hand, but not as originally planned. Petter's scheme had been elegant in its simplicity: manipulate Cersei into poisoning Jon Arryn. Once the Lord of the Vale was dead, he could sow discord between the Lannisters and Starks while remaining safely in the shadows. But Cersei, for all her ruthlessness, hesitated. She stalled and stalled until Jon Arryn was ready to act, ready to confront Robert with the truth about her children's parentage and have both her and Jaime arrested. Faced with that looming disaster, Petter was forced to activate his backup plan. He convinced Lysa Arryn to poison her own husband. It was effortless, really. Lysa was a fool. She believed every lie he whispered in her ear, believed she was protecting her son. With Jon dead, the pieces of Petter's puzzle began falling into place. Eddard Stark had arrived in King's Landing with his righteous northern ideals. A minor knight became the next pawn, an expendable figure Petter had maneuvered into position. First, he persuaded Robert to knight the young man for his loyal service. Next, he arranged for the knight to earn a small fortune, just enough to buy himself armor and enter the tournament. Then came the crucial step, whispering carefully chosen suspicions into Cersei's ear. It worked like a charm. Cersei, ever the paranoid lioness, feared that he had learned too much. She ordered Gregor Clegane to deal with the man. A mountain crushed an ant. The murder bore the unmistakable stamp of House Lannister, exactly as Petter had intended. But then came that damned letter, the so-called testimony. The very existence of those words unraveled everything he had built. The writing wasn't the knight's. Petter was certain of it. The man had never even been near Lysa Arryn, let alone learned of the conspiracy. Someone had fabricated the note and timed its release perfectly. Who? Varys, perhaps. The spider was the only one with the reach and the cunning to orchestrate something like this. But if Varys had known the truth, why not move sooner? Why not stop Jon Arryn's death in the first place? No. Varys had his secrets, but this didn't feel like his work. The eunuch might scheme and manipulate, but he didn't leave his enemies clueless. Petter had studied his rival's style for years. Varys always let you glimpse a corner of the web just enough to know you'd been caught. Who else then? The stark fool Eddard didn't have the subtlety. The queen, she couldn't outsmart a fish. Renly, a dilettante. Stannis, too straightforward. If he knew of Petter's involvement, he would have had him arrested immediately. Petter rubbed his temples. His mind kept circling the same barren terrain. If Varys hadn't done it and none of the usual suspects had the capacity for it, who the hell had? The Titan loomed closer now, its burning eyes staring down at him like twin accusations. Petter clenched his jaw. The Vale had once been his failsafe, a sanctuary to retreat to if things went wrong. But with the alliance of righteous in open revolt, that option was gone. He needed a new plan. The Juniflower glided past the Titan's legs, entering the harbor. Braavos was his last refuge. There, hidden from the eyes of Westeros, Petter Baelish intended to sell his final secret asset. The gold would be enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, as long as he rid himself of the royal guards trailing him and disappeared before Robert Baratheon sent anyone after him. Petter Baelish stood at the edge of the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The briny sea breeze tugged at his cloak, and the ship beneath his feet, the Juniflower, glided through the gray-green waves with steady determination. The morning fog thinned as the sun rose higher, revealing the jagged ridge of rocks that guarded Braavos' lagoon. Moments later, the Titan came into view. The Titan of Braavos, colossal, ageless, unyielding. The stone colossus straddled the narrow entrance to the harbor, his feet anchored on twin crags of black granite, as though he held the sea itself at bay. Time and wind had darkened his weathered surface, yet the bronze war skirt encircling his waist still glinted faintly in the light. A massive breastplate covered his chest, and a half-helm crowned his head, its crest adorned with a sculpted laurel. Green ropes of hemp hair fell to his shoulders like seaweed-drenched locks. His eyes were empty caves with flames burning in their depths. One hand gripped a stone outcrop, the other thrust a broken sword skyward, as though in eternal defiance of the waves below. The Titan had stood sentinel over Braavos for centuries. Petter had seen it before, more times than he cared to remember. Today it evoked no awe, only resentment. The Titan's gaze bored into him as the Juniflower approached the harbor. Petter turned away from the sight and instead forced himself to consider his next moves. He was no longer Littlefinger, master of coin, no longer the clever puppeteer behind the Iron Throne's purse strings. The game had shifted, the board upended. But the game isn't over. Viserys Targaryen might be a promising candidate for his next gamble. The last known male heir of the Targaryens, a wandering exile in Essos. But the intelligence reports Petter had acquired painted the Beggar King as impulsive and arrogant, a fool convinced of his own divine right. No, that option was too risky. Perhaps another player. The Juniflower sliced through the harbor waters, passing beneath the Titan's legs. The sunlight caught the bronze sheen of the war skirt, momentarily blinding Petter. He blinked away the glare and turned to face the two guards standing at his back. "Braavos welcomes us," he said with a charming smile, slipping effortlessly into his familiar persona. "And we should extend our gratitude, don't you think?" The guards exchanged wary glances. "Gratitude?" one asked. "Of course," Petter spread his hands. "His Majesty will deal with repaying the loan, we're only here to secure it. In the meantime, Braavos boasts some of the finest hospitality in the world." His smile deepened. "I insist, my treat, you've both worked so hard on this journey. A little wine, a little music, perhaps the company of some kind-hearted locals." Outside the tent, the sun shone brightly, casting its warmth over the coalition camp. It seemed like just another ordinary day. When Aegor woke up naturally dressed and stepped out of his tent, he immediately sensed that something felt off. After observing his surroundings for a moment, he quickly identified the source of the strange atmosphere. Many soldiers around him were pointing and whispering while gazing toward the eastern sky. Following their line of sight, Aegor raised his head and squinted against the sunlight. Soon he spotted what had captured everyone's attention. Low in the eastern sky, a comet hung silently beside the rising sun. Its tail was long and blood-red, like a bloody gash carved into the blue skin of the sky or a blazing fragment torn from the sun itself. A red comet. The reason he hadn't noticed it immediately upon leaving the tent was that the sun's newly risen brilliance had initially obscured the crimson streak, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. Its vivid hue and intense brightness stood starkly against the sky, undiminished even in the presence of the sun. He couldn't help but wonder what it would look like at night. That comet might shine as brightly as a full moon. Aegor felt a chill run through him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He racked his brain but couldn't remember any specific significance behind the comet. It had been too long since he'd read the original A Song of Ice and Fire, and the details had grown hazy. He vaguely recalled that a red comet had appeared when Daenerys Targaryen hatched her 3 dragons. But was the comet a consequence of the dragon's birth and the resurgence of magic, or had its arrival heralded the return of magic, thus enabling the eggs to hatch? He had no idea. Not that it mattered. Daenerys was far away beyond his reach. People often said that if one traveled to this world, they should find and seduce the most beautiful woman it had to offer. But after experiencing life here firsthand, Aegor realized how impractical such fantasies were. Survival left little room for romantic notions. Besides, Tyrion Lannister would likely stay in Westeros to focus on his money games, altering the course of events. Aegor remembered. Without the sharpest mind in the Seven Kingdoms supporting her, who knew if the Dragon Queen could successfully reclaim her family's throne? As for how beautiful or magical this prophesied queen might be, well, Aegor would just have to wait and see if they ever crossed paths. He tried to dismiss thoughts of Daenerys, but the comet's image lingered in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he instinctively began analyzing it with the logical reasoning from his old world. Such a striking comet, if it followed an orbital path around the sun, should have gradually become visible over time. It shouldn't have appeared so suddenly, nor should it be visible in daylight with such clarity. Something about it defied the natural laws he understood. It looked so close, dangerously close. If it truly were near the planet, its angular velocity should make it streak rapidly across the sky rather than hang motionless like a bloody scar. Could it be further away than it seemed? Perhaps it only appeared so vivid because of its immense size, but that didn't add up either. A celestial body that large would cause noticeable gravitational disturbances, yet the world remained calm and unaffected. Unless it was relatively small and shared a near-parallel orbit with the planet, giving the illusion of stillness. But if that were true, how had it appeared so suddenly? Aegor's head throbbed as the contradictions piled up. After a while, he decided to stop trying to make sense of it. This world often defied the principles he once held as truths. The Red Comet was just one more mystery in a land already filled with magic, dragons, and prophecies. Knowledge from another world had its limits here. The sooner he accepted that, the better. Instead of dwelling on cosmic anomalies, he needed to focus on surviving this harsh reality and adapting to its unfamiliar rules. Everyone's saying that the appearance of the bloody comet is a sign that the bloody gate will definitely fall, Casey reported excitedly, repeating the rumors he'd picked up around the camp. Bloody comet, bloody gate. Aegor's lips curved into a faint smile. The logic does have a certain appeal. Do you believe it? Isn't it true? Boy hesitated, clearly inclined to say yes, but under the sharp gaze of the Night's Watch chief logistics officer quickly corrected himself. I mean, no, I don't believe it. I'd wager there are people inside the bloody gate whispering the same thing, saying the comet foretells King Robert's defeat and the collapse of his coalition. Believe it or not, it's your choice. Just remember to think for yourself. No matter what conclusion you reach, whether it's right or wrong, it's better than blindly following others. Oh, I understand, the boy responded, though Aegor doubted he truly absorbed the lesson. Aegor gave a brief nod and said no more. Whether others acknowledged it or not, he'd become a man with influence, and it was both natural and necessary to guide the people around him. After all, the more capable his subordinates, the stronger his position and the more promising his future. That day, the Martell forces were responsible for the assault on the bloody gate. After a charge that resulted in casualties on both sides, they declared the day's siege efforts complete and retreated to their camp to re-establish defensive positions. People often say you don't know your limits until you push yourself. A month and a half after leaving King's Landing, Aegor had met most of the knights and minor lords from the Six Kingdoms who had answered the king's call to war. Among them, 40 or 50 had shown interest in the Night's Watch's bond offerings. Even if only half followed through and each invested just 100 gold dragons, that would still amount to thousands of gold dragons raised for the cause. By the time he finished breakfast, the sun had climbed higher, yet the crimson comet remained visible in the eastern sky. Having spent a year at Castle Black, Aegor had grown accustomed to strange and imposing sights. Compared to the immensity of the wall, this streak of blood across the sky hardly seemed worth noting, so long as it didn't come crashing down to obliterate mankind. Life went on. The business he could conduct within the coalition camp was nearing its conclusion. Now Aegor was simply waiting for Castle Black to send a raven or a brother of the Watch to relieve him of his temporary post. Once that happened, he could return to King's Landing and continue expanding the Night's Watch's financial ventures. The war's outcome? That was Robert Baratheon's concern, not the Watch's. With the burden of responsibility temporarily lifted from his shoulders, Aegor allowed himself to enjoy a rare moment of leisure. He wandered the camp aimlessly, considering which noble or officer he might visit, and silently rejoicing that, no matter what happened on the battlefield, he would never have to fight. Ahead, beneath a towering banner depicting a crowned stag in red and gold, a din of cheers, shouts, and clashing steel filled the air. When an army was encamped, soldiers needed distractions beyond drinking, gambling, or chasing camp followers. Competitions provided that entertainment. The men divided themselves into teams, often based on their lord's allegiances, and held contests of all kinds: jousts, group skirmishes, one-on-one duels. Victors earned glory for their banners, losers sought revenge by sending in stronger challengers. Casey reveled in every competition, but after watching a few rounds, Aegor quickly lost interest. Skill at arms was undeniably a valuable talent. Most of the men in the ring were better fighters than he was. Yet in his experience, those who swam the best were often the ones who drowned. The more proficient these men became with sword and shield, the closer they drifted toward danger and death. Aegor's ambitions lay elsewhere. His was a different game, one that influenced the entire realm from behind the scenes. If he succeeded, he would not only shape the world but also keep himself far from the peril of the battlefield. Just as he was preparing to leave, the tone of the crowd's cheers shifted, drawing his attention back to the competition. "Beauty!" someone shouted. "Prince!" echoed another voice. Aegor narrowed his eyes. Were they talking about Brienne of Tarth fighting Oberyn Martell the Red Viper? In this counterinsurgency war, how many minor characters from the world of ice and fire had gathered here at this coalition base? Countless. Due to limited time and his low status, Aegor had neither the opportunity nor the means to visit and get to know these individuals one by one. Not to mention the two renowned warriors, Oberyn Martell the Red Viper and Brienne of Tarth the Beauty. He had never even met them before. The former was inaccessible due to his high status, while the latter was likely overlooked because her tent was too inconspicuous. Now that they had encountered them, it was only natural not to let the opportunity slip away. Even if they couldn't get acquainted, at least recognizing each other the next time they crossed paths would be worthwhile. With Casey, who was visibly thrilled, Aegor squeezed his way toward the competition circle. Hundreds of people had gathered, forming a tightly packed crowd around the competition circle. It took significant effort for him to push through to a spot where he could see the fight clearly. Beautiful. "Beauty, finish him off!" Amid the cheers of the surrounding soldiers, Aegor saw the two warriors locked in battle. One of them, much taller, was fully clad in blue armor from head to toe, with even the eyes concealed. Opposite the armored figure stood a black-haired, black-eyed man holding a spear. Oberyn Martell, he guessed. Compared to his opponent, the Red Viper seemed almost unprotected. Aside from greaves, vambraces, throat armor, a war skirt, and a helmet without a face guard, he wore only soft leather and smooth silk beneath his armor. The chainmail, layered with polished copper scales, barely covered a quarter of his body. Aegor wasn't familiar with the sigil of House Tarth, but from the shouts of the crowd, he quickly confirmed that the Red Viper's opponent was indeed the beauty, Brienne. After a closer look at the Blue Knight, he couldn't help but exclaim internally, "Gods, this woman is tall." Standing before Brienne, fully armored and wearing thick combat boots, Oberyn barely reached her chest. Yet despite his clear disadvantage in both height and protection, the Red Viper tilted his head with a playful smile, his tone laced with provocation. "Come on, girl, I'll admit you're the toughest woman I've ever faced. You're not going to run out of steam already, are you?" Under the urging and cheers of the crowd, Brienne roared and charged forward again. The longsword in her hands gleamed with cold light as it slashed toward Oberyn with ruthless precision. Aegor had served as a ranger for over a year and wasn't entirely ignorant of swordplay. With just one swing, he recognized that Brienne's skills lived up to her reputation. His old barracks companion at Castle Blackberry, who'd wielded a sword for 40 years, might hold out for a few moves against her. But if Aegor himself tried conventional defensive maneuvers against that fierce, unrelenting attack, he'd be defeated in no time. As the surrounding soldiers jeered, Oberyn nimbly sidestepped the strike with a graceful spin. Without even glancing back, he casually thrust the butt of his spear into Brienne's armored lower back, causing her to stumble forward and nearly crash into the onlookers. Brienne doesn't stand a chance against him. Aegor quickly understood. If she shed the armor and relied on her strength and speed alone, she might have had a slim hope. But without protection, Oberyn's spear would still find its mark. In a life-and-death duel, the outcome wouldn't change. "I surrender." Before Aegor could think further, the tall knight threw down her sword and tore off her helmet with both hands. After announcing her surrender, she turned and pushed her way through the crowd without looking back, sending several men tumbling as they failed to stop her. That's it. Aegor stood in stunned silence. Surrendering after just one exchange didn't seem like the behavior of a so-called beauty. After a moment of confusion, the reason became clear. Brienne must have fought Oberyn for quite some time before Aegor arrived, enduring countless humiliating feints and provocations. Realizing she had no chance of victory and faced with the Red Viper's relentless teasing, she ultimately threw down her sword and left in anger. The audience booed, but there was no real shame in surrendering to the Prince of Dorne, who was undeniably an exceptional warrior. Watching the beauty leave, Oberyn Martell chuckled and called out loudly, "Dorne's spearmanship is the finest in the world. Does anyone dare challenge that?" The crowd immediately quieted. Many people turned to one another, nudging and urging others to step forward. Yet after much pushing and shoving, no one dared to enter the arena. Aegor snorted in disdain. In this coalition camp, those capable of matching Oberyn Martell were either standing beside their lords or clad in white robes, guarding the king. For someone of Oberyn's stature to step forward and challenge the lesser knights here, it felt like he was taking advantage of them. Having accomplished his goal of getting a glimpse of both the Red Viper and the beauty, Aegor was about to leave and see if there were any other notable nobles worth observing. But just as he turned around, someone grabbed his sleeve. "Wait, isn't the White Walker Slayer here? Let him go up against the prince. Let's see the Night's Watch in action. White Walker Slayer, White Walker Slayer." The chants spread like wildfire.
Author's note: this chapter weaves two quiet storms together. one born of paranoia and collapsing schemes, the other of omens, belief, and spectacle. As Petir flees toward exile, hunted not by blades but by an unseen intellect, Aegor stands beneath a blood-scarred sky, watching how symbols bend armies and rumors become fuel for war. Here, fear wears many masks. Sometimes it whispers in the mind, sometimes it blazes across the heavens, and sometimes it cheers for a fight it barely understands.
The crowd's noise surged, blending with cries of Night's Watch and Chief Logistics Officer. Before Aegor could react, several soldiers pinned him down. He barely had time to resist before being shoved into the arena. It was no exaggeration to say that Aegor had become something of a celebrity. The fantasy adventures of the Night's Watch had been on the market for a few weeks now, although its sales lagged behind the more sensational publications released around the same time. There was a limit to how long people could spend reading body stories. While many of the coalition soldiers were illiterate peasants, the combined forces of 6 kingdoms brought together a far higher literacy rate than most other places in Westeros or even the world. Here, perhaps 1 in 10 people could read, if not more. And of course, even those who couldn't read could still enjoy the tale when literate comrades read it aloud. As one of the first books available in camp, The Journey of Adventure stood out with its unusual protagonist, a member of the Night's Watch rather than a noble knight, and its fresh, unconventional narrative. Word of mouth did the rest, spreading the tale far and wide. Aegor had originally hoped the book would tell the world that he was a foreigner who'd been forced to join the Night's Watch due to a language barrier. He wanted to shed light on the Black Brothers' struggles against the Wildlings and White Walkers, hoping to improve the world's opinion of the Night's Watch. But reality rarely aligns with one's intentions. For reasons he couldn't fathom, readers seemed to ignore the larger message entirely. Instead, the story's most popular detail became the passage about him defeating a White Walker in hand-to-hand combat in the haunted forest. This one section, largely true, ironically became the focal point of the book's popularity. The result, instead of improving the Night's Watch's reputation, the book inadvertently painted Aegor as a braggart. His so-called legend spread throughout the camp, with more than a few listeners adding an imaginary pair of quotation marks around the title White Walker Slayer. A tale that was 99% fabricated left the single truthful detail in doubt. Aegor didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Back in the modern world, he might have considered this a textbook case of a public relations disaster and poor narrative control. Fortunately, the book never explicitly named him, and the cover even claimed it was purely fictional. The negative perception was irritating, but the notoriety and the profits still worked in his favor. He tried to comfort himself with that logic. But now, shoved into the arena and facing one of the greatest warriors in the 7 kingdoms, Aegor realized his so-called fame had become a liability. "So you're the legendary White Walker Slayer. I've heard of your great name for quite some time." Oberyn twirled his spear with practiced ease, then planted it firmly into the ground. His eyes swept up and down his new opponent. "Ah, it seems the rumors aren't all fiction after all. You really aren't from Westeros, are you?" "I come from a place called Cena, west of the Sunset Sea." Since he'd already been shoved into the arena, there was no point in turning tail and diving back into the crowd. Losing to Oberyn wouldn't bring shame, but lacking the courage to face him would only further damage the Night's Watch's already tarnished reputation. Thinking quickly, Aegor decided to make the first move, at least verbally. "Dorne's spearmanship is the best in the world. I have no argument with that. But since I'm already here, I'd like to experience it firsthand. Do you have a blunt sword? The lighter, the better." "A blunt sword?" A Dornish soldier immediately sneered. "Ha, you'd be lucky just to touch the hem of my prince's cloak." Oberyn, well into middle age and long past the hot-headedness of youth, merely shook his head. Let the boy choose whatever weapons and armor suit him best. If there's nothing here to his liking, he can send for his own gear. There's no need to fret over a blunt sword. Well, Aegor did have a sword with him, though for someone of his meager skill there wasn't much difference between his own weapon and a standard practice blade. He gave a self-deprecating shrug. "Your Highness, you may not know this, but the Night's Watch mostly fights wildlings. In terms of martial prowess, they're not much different from ordinary farmers. The only real challenge is their overwhelming numbers. The more you use your brain, the sharper it gets." After leaving the wall and partnering with Tyrion in King's Landing, Aegor had cultivated the habit of warming up his mental muscles daily. He'd trained himself not to panic or freeze when faced with unexpected situations. Standing in that circle, it took only a few seconds for several potential strategies to surface in his mind. 1,000 Night's Watch brothers must defend against nearly 200,000 wildlings beyond the wall. On average, that's 200 foes for each of us. He exaggerated the numbers slightly. "Almost every battle we fight is against overwhelming odds. That's why our training focuses on offense over defense. Only by swiftly dispatching the enemy before us can we assist our comrades or move to the next target. If we hesitate, we risk being surrounded." Technically, that wasn't a complete lie. Most wildlings fled at the mere sight of rangers unless they set an ambush. Beyond the wall, the Night's Watch rarely bothered with wildling villages unless they posed a direct threat. In truth, occasional bartering for supplies wasn't unheard of, though the common folk in the 7 kingdoms imagined a constant, bloody conflict. So, Oberyn cocked his head intrigued. He knew little about the Night's Watch. After all, no member of House Martell had ever been exiled to the Wall. So, Aegor continued earnestly, our combat style is more instinctive, wild even. We're always preparing for real war, not civilized duels. We don't fight for honor, we fight to kill. His tone was serious despite the nonsense spilling from his mouth. Of course, your highness's martial skill is unmatched. You're no wildling and I'm merely a logistics officer. I wouldn't dare boast about my chances with a real sword. I'm afraid if I get flustered, I might injure myself. It's hard to strike a man who flatters you so openly. Aegor had deliberately softened his tone, conceding inferiority and appealing to Oberyn's better nature. The Red Viper, who bore no particular grudge against the Night's Watch, chuckled and nodded. Very well, bring the man a blunt sword. With a flick of his wrist, Oberyn tossed his spear to a soldier standing at the edge of the crowd. The man quickly returned with a blunt, practiced spear. It was an unwritten rule. When one combatant opted for a dulled weapon, the other was expected to follow suit, a nod to chivalry, even here on the eve of war. Though the realm was at war, the men here still adhered to certain codes. Aegor accepted the practice sword and declined the offer of protective armor, opting instead for a small round shield just large enough to guard his vitals. Facing an opponent as agile as Oberyn while weighed down with heavy armor would be pure folly. His sword skills were already mediocre. Adding cumbersome gear would only worsen his odds. Besides, Oberyn wasn't a bloodthirsty brute. As one of Dorne's ruling elite, he had no reason to seriously harm a Night's Watchman, especially in an informal duel like this. If the prince genuinely wished him harm, armor wouldn't make much difference anyway. Still, caution was warranted. By pushing for blunt weapons and declaring his preference for offense over defense, Aegor hoped to provoke Oberyn into underestimating him. Masters like the Red Viper often grow arrogant in the face of amateurs. If he thinks I'm nothing more than an overeager novice, maybe, just maybe, he'll leave an opening. The Night's Watch trains for survival, not showmanship, Aegor said, tightening his grip on the hilt. We aim to kill, not fight fair. I look forward to seeing Dorne's legendary spearmanship in action. Please go easy on me. The words were courteous, the tone humble, but for the first time since being shoved into the arena, Aegor felt a spark of genuine resolve. Admit you're a coward, use your best moves, then find the right moment to lose or surrender. That was Aegor's entire plan. It sounded simple, but executing it was far more difficult. After standing with his sword raised for only a few seconds, Aegor realized he had no idea how to attack. Oberyn stood across from him, relaxed and casual, spinning his spear like a golden hoop as if he were performing for children. From the outside, his posture seemed riddled with openings, but Aegor knew better. Every move was deliberate, every gap an illusion. He could already picture it. The moment he lunged, Oberyn's counterattack would come with lightning speed, leaving him flailing like Brienne of Tarth had minutes earlier. This is what it feels like to face a true master, Aegor thought. After less than 10 seconds of facing the Red Viper, he felt like one of those doomed villains from a martial arts tale, a pawn confronting the story's hero. His instincts screamed that any attack would be suicidal, while standing still only prolonged the inevitable. His grip tightened on his shield as beads of sweat trickled down his back, despite the summer warmth of the valley. Come on, White Walker Slayer, shouted a voice from the crowd, someone eager to see blood spilled as long as it wasn't their own. Show that southerner what northerners can do, added another, this one clearly from the north. The Northmen always treated the black-clad brothers as their own. Stop dawdling and fight already, complained a third voice betraying complete ignorance of swordplay. Only amateurs dismissed the opening moments of a duel as mere time-wasting. Oberyn, meanwhile, studied his opponent with a practiced eye. The boy had clearly received training, nothing extraordinary, but he wasn't just flailing around either. The prince had crossed swords with mercenaries like him many times before. Still, there was something puzzling about him. The accent, the clothes. Where had he said he was from? West of the Sunset Sea, clean-cut, sharp eyes. Oberyn's lips curved into a wicked smirk. He suddenly wondered if this so-called White Walker Slayer might be as adventurous in bed as he was on the battlefield. He spread his arms wide, leaving his chest exposed in mock invitation. Come on, he called, voice low and smooth. You take the first shot. Aegor had no inkling of the prince's personal intrigue. He only saw an opening, finally, a genuine gap to exploit. If I hesitate now, he'll grow bored and punish me for it. You're not here to win, just attack and get it over with. Planting his left foot into the dirt, Aegor launched himself forward, raising a small cloud of dust in his wake. The sword in his hand was lighter than he expected, a fortunate choice by the tournament's organizer. His custom-made black clothes, free of armor or leather, didn't restrict his movements in the slightest. He moved with unexpected speed, his sword thrusting forward like a bolt of lightning. Oberyn's expression shifted from amusement to surprise. He hadn't stepped into this ring solely for fun. He had hoped that by trouncing a few lesser knights, he might provoke one of the Lannisters into retaliating. If only Gregor Clegane would show himself, he thought darkly. Yet the Lannisters in camp had grown scarce since the fights began. Instead, they'd sent this Night's Watchman into the ring, an unknown man with an odd accent and surprising speed. Oberyn pivoted instinctively, his body reacting before his mind caught up. The spear's tip flicked toward the oncoming sword, intercepting the thrust with an effortless tap. His instincts screamed to counter with a sweep at the legs, an easy, humiliating move, but he hesitated. Aegor had only come south from the Wall a few months ago. During his free time in King's Landing, he'd kept up with some basic training, often sparring with Arya for hours at a time. His technique hadn't improved much, but his physical fitness, muscle strength, reflexes, and endurance remained sharp. Now, as his first thrust missed its target, he realized he'd won his gamble. He immediately shifted his grip, dropped his wrist, and bypassed Oberyn's spear tip. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he swung his lightweight one-handed sword in a swift, unexpected arc. Oberyn twisted his spear in response, drawing a small circle in the air to dissolve the blow before countering with a sharp jab. The blunt spear shot toward Aegor's chest with terrifying speed. Though it lacked a lethal tip, instinct screamed that it would pierce his heart. He reacted without thinking, twisting his torso and raising his shield just in time. The spear struck the shield with surprising force, sending a wave of numbness up his arm. The prince hadn't even exerted full force. Aegor was certain of it. Still, he couldn't afford to hesitate. Clenching his teeth, he pushed closer and lunged again. "Nice!" The crowd erupted in cheers. Everyone knew the saying, an inch longer, an inch stronger. A sword by nature was disadvantaged against a spear. The only viable tactic was to close the distance. Aegor's bold move, though more instinctive than strategic, gave the illusion that he'd successfully forced Oberyn into close quarters, seemingly gaining the upper hand. Had Brienne still been there, or if a true master like Sir Barristan Selmy or Jaime Lannister had been watching, they would have sneered at the crowd's naivety. They would have pointed out that Oberyn was humoring his opponent. Aegor's movements were riddled with flaws, his technique unpolished. But the Red Viper, rather than exploiting these weaknesses, was deliberately engaging Aegor at his strongest point: speed. Some might call it reckless, others would call it pride. Oberyn wanted to beat Aegor where he was strongest, to prove that Dorne's spearmen were peerless in every sense. Ping! Bang! Even Aegor struggled to process what had just happened. One moment he was mid-swing. Next, his shield and sword simultaneously absorbed powerful strikes that sent him staggering back half a step just beyond spear range. The crowd, blissfully unaware of the gap in skill, roared with excitement. They thought they were witnessing a clash between masters. Aegor, on the other hand, was painfully aware of how one-sided the fight truly was. "Come on, Night's Watchman." Oberyn grinned, spreading his arms in mock invitation once again. Aegor's head throbbed from the prince's lightning-quick counterattack. His original plan had been to find an excuse to surrender after a few moves, but Oberyn's teasing got under his skin. "I can't back down now, not this soon." Gritting his teeth, he charged again. Raising his shield horizontally to cover his chest and lifting the sword above his head, he sprinted forward and brought the blade down in a powerful overhead slash. The last time he'd used this move was against the White Walkers. It was an ill-suited tactic against an opponent with a spear, but Oberyn didn't seem inclined to hurt him. That fact gave Aegor just enough confidence to commit. "Good," Oberyn called, nimbly sidestepping the downward strike. As he retreated, his spear tip flicked the blade aside with contemptuous ease. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he thrust the blunt spear toward Aegor's face, stopping mere inches from his nose before tapping the shield again. "If this spear were real, I'd have a hole through my skull right now." The realization sent a cold shiver down Aegor's spine. Oberyn hadn't merely dodged and counterattacked. He'd done so with deliberate flair, casually reminding his opponent how easily he could end the fight if he wished. Despite exceeding his usual abilities, Aegor was being utterly outclassed. His plan to feign defeat, laughable. Against someone this skilled, he couldn't even lose convincingly. Every time he tried to create an opportunity, the Red Viper shut him down with humiliating ease. So this is what true mastery looks like. He clenched his sword tighter. He'd always dismissed martial prowess as irrelevant compared to money, status, and strategy. But here, in this moment, it hit him. Skill with a blade could be the difference between life and death, between survival and slaughter. "I need to take my training seriously. I don't need to become a master, just good enough to defend myself." The crowd's cheers continued, oblivious to Aegor's internal epiphany. They saw only the fearless Night's Watchman pressing the Prince of Dorne with relentless attacks. They cheered his ferocity and Oberyn's graceful counters without grasping the vast gulf between the two fighters. Aegor, meanwhile, recognized his predicament. He saw Oberyn's playful smirk and understood the prince was toying with him. Yet for all his awareness, he lacked the skill to punish that carelessness. He was stuck, unable to retreat without humiliation, incapable of surprising his opponent with brute force. Ironically, the skill gap that doomed him also brought an unexpected advantage. There was no real risk of harming Oberyn. The swelling crowd shouted louder and louder, drawn by the promise of a duel between the Red Viper and the White Walker Slayer. Aegor exhaled, steadied himself, and charged once more. His shield slammed into the oncoming spear, pushing it aside as he forced his way into close quarters. The crisp clang of clashing weapons mixed with the shouts and jeers of the onlookers, creating a cacophony around the arena. Aegor's relentless attacks were deflected time and again without him suffering any real harm. With that weight lifted from his mind, he abandoned caution and swung his one-handed sword with full force, leaving faint afterimages in the air. Oberyn's spear moved even faster, weaving through the strikes like a serpent, dazzling the crowd. Thrust without pausing, then follow with a swift slash while catching his breath. Knock the spear aside with the shield and keep pushing forward. Few dared to fight this way. Such an aggressive, unyielding rhythm could easily cause one's stance to falter, exposing fatal gaps, but Aegor had committed fully to offense, discarding defense entirely. He didn't care about openings anymore, there was no plan to win, only to survive with some shred of dignity. Ping, pang, bang, the sharp, rhythmic sounds of steel meeting would echoed through the circle. How long had it been? 30 seconds, a minute? Longer? Aegor couldn't tell. He only knew he'd repeated every drill he'd once taught Arya, moves he'd demonstrated absent-mindedly months ago in King's Landing. But the difference between the Red Viper and himself was infinitely greater than that between himself and Arya. No matter how fast he attacked, no matter how unorthodox or desperate the strike, Oberyn intercepted each blow at the exact moment it reached its peak momentum. Then with a casual flick he would tap the edge of Aegor's shield with his spear. Just enough force to leave a visible dent, never enough to crack it or knock it from his grasp. From a technical standpoint, the fight resembled a master toying with his apprentice. But the spectators, ignorant of the nuances, only saw Aegor's dogged persistence and Oberyn's measured counters. Bang! Aegor staggered backward as another precise strike jarred his shield. When he regained his footing, his muscles screamed in protest. His stamina was spent, his arms burned from the effort. Glancing down, he saw the wooden shield riddled with pits and grooves. Those spear marks, he realized, represented the many times Oberyn had chosen not to hit his body. His left forearm throbbed from countless glancing blows. The skin scraped raw beneath the shield's straps, burned with every movement. I should have worn gloves. Aegor sucked in a deep breath and raised his eyes. Oberyn stood across the circle, still composed, still smirking, and then the prince gave him a deliberate wink. What does that mean? Is he telling me to surrender or to keep going? Aegor hesitated. He'd exhausted his strongest moves and his body was flagging. He could drag the fight out longer by cycling through every sword technique he knew, but what was the point? He'd gained enough face. Time to surrender while I still have some dignity. Aegor, where are you? The sudden call jolted Aegor from his thoughts. His first instinct was to ignore it. Getting distracted during a duel was a surefire way to get killed. But then his mind caught up with the opportunity that had just fallen into his lap. A perfect excuse to bow out, feigning confusion. Aegor lowered his sword and turned toward the voice. Oberyn followed his gaze toward a nearby hill. A soldier was leading a figure dressed in black toward the ring. Aegor squinted and immediately recognized the newcomer. Yoren, finally, the gods must be smiling on me today. He loosened the shield straps and let the battered wood drop to the ground. Your Highness, your skill is unmatched. It's been a true honor. He bowed deeply. But the wall has sent a messenger south. Must be an important matter, and I need to receive my brother from Castle Black. I surrender. For the first time in his life, Aegor found that surrendering could feel genuinely satisfying. He walked to the edge of the circle, handed the practice sword to the nearest attendant, and made a beeline for the approaching black-cloaked figure. Official duties must come first, Oberyn called after him, still leaning on his spear with that same lazy smile. Perhaps we can pick up where we left off this evening. A little more spear and sword practice, and maybe a lively discussion about life while we're at it.
Author's note: this chapter turns spectacle into survival. What begins as rumor-made fame drags Aegor into the harsh light of real skill, where legends collapse and mastery exposes every shortcut. Against Oberyn, he learns the difference between noise and nuance, between looking fierce and being dangerous. Here, pride bruises, illusions shatter, and a simple truth takes root. Influence may shape the world, but a steady hand can decide whether you live long enough to enjoy it. This chapter comes to an end, but the nation never sleeps. More legends await on FanFic Nation, where imagination rules and every story begins with a choice. Subscribe and return for the next legend.